Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for this UN Behavioral Science Week session with a discussion with Professor Susan Athey. We've heard you have come to us numerous times to get a discussion with Susan Athey, so we're very excited to have her with us today. But before we get into our talk, what we're going to start, I'll start by just sharing a few words about Behavioral Science Week. So if you're here, there's a good chance you know that Behavioral Science Week is taking place this week. We have 5 days of events, 46 entities coming together, and over 60 speakers. So lots to check out, not only today, but over the next few days. So you'll see a theme throughout the week that we've had is when it comes to this idea of data and digital application. We've had the high-level opening on that topic. We have Professor Athey today. We also have a session tomorrow on AI and behavioral science, more of an intro, and then also discussion of behavioral science and data taking place tomorrow as well. So lots more to explore if you're interested in this topic and hearing about the UN experiences in this area as well. All right, so just a bit of context in terms of the UN Behavioral Science Group. So this is the initiative that is coordinating UN Behavioral Science Week this year. We bring together over 7,000 members from more than 70 UN entities and 150 countries. So lots of interest and demand when it comes to behavioral science across the UN. And you're welcome to join the group even if you're not in the UN. You can join as an observer and be invited to our webinars and hear about our updates happening across the UN as well. So I'll put some of those links in the chat for you to check out to join the group. Also wanted to flag here, why are we exploring behavioral science throughout the UN? There's a lot you'll hear about in terms of evidence and impact and the value that behavioral science provides on its own, but also because behavioral science is part of this UN 2.0 quintet of change. So these are 5 areas the Secretary General has deemed important for the UN to be nimble and effective and really deliver on its ambitious agenda. They include data and digital, innovation, strategic foresight, as well as behavioral science. So you can see some of the intersections there that we'll probably be exploring today as well as throughout the week. But really, this has been a focus of a lot of colleagues in the Secretary General's office, but also now increasingly very much so across the UN too. Okay, so with that, as I think it was shared in the chat already, there are some resources. There's the UN Secretary General's Guidance on Behavioral Science. There's also the UN Practitioner's Guide to Getting Started with Behavioral Science, as well as the UN Behavioral Science Review, which features case studies from colleagues applying behavioral science across the UN. So I encourage you to check those out, as well as to join the Behavioral Science Group, as there's lots more to explore throughout the week and following as well. Okay, so in terms of how today's session will be run, we please ask that you put your questions in the Q&A. The questions of your colleagues and upvote ones that you might not have yourself, but other people might have in the session today. And then we can have a meaningful discussion to really orient ourselves towards the interests of those in the room. Okay, so with that, I'm going to stop sharing and introduce our speaker for today. So we're very fortunate to have with us Professor Athey, who's a professor at the Stanford Business School. She's also a leader when it comes to areas of tech, policy, as well as economics. Her work over the years has been at the intersection of AI, as well as, sorry, apologies. Sorry, a bit of technical difficulties. It's been at the intersection of AI and digital markets. Her work in this context is also really relevant to that of the UN, that she focuses on healthcare and education, looking at incentive design, as well as thinking through some of the AI implications of those and digitalization. So she's also been an advisor and lead when it comes to tech leaders as well. She's the former chief economist at Microsoft, as well as the chief economist at the US Department of Justice and Antitrust Division. And we're very fortunate to have her with us today to talk about some examples in terms of where behavioral science and AI and digitalization intersect today and where we could be potentially going in the future. So with that, over to you, Professor Athey.
Thanks so much. And can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Just let me know if there's any problems. Let me get the screen going. All right. Very good. So it's such an honor to be here today, and I'm really grateful for you having me here. And it's so fabulous that you put this event together to have these discussions. When we talked about this session, when Mary and I were chatting, there's so much to talk about and so many different directions. So I'm going to give a little bit of a taste and an overview for some of the themes, but I'm really excited to expand on those themes or go in different directions in the discussion as well for all the things I've left out. So as Mary mentioned, I come to this problem from a couple of different angles. I've worked inside big and small tech companies in trying to implement digital interventions that have behavioral components. I've thought about it from the perspective of public policy. And then at Stanford, I have a lab that is implementing a lot of these things in practice in collaboration with implementing organizations in the social sector. And my lab is really designed to try to use digital technology and social science together, and often behavioral, for impact. So here I want to give, just so it's not so abstract, I'm going to give a few examples of the kind of work we've been doing, and then I'm going to dive into one particular application to kind of flesh out in more detail. But I want to kind of talk about a couple of different kind of both substantive themes of the work, as well as a few of the kind of more technical or like methods themes, if you like. So starting with like digital education for students and learners, this had a lot of potential before large language models really got good, but it has even more now. Most of my work so far is from the pre-ChatGPT time period, but we have both papers that try to implement better better systems for helping people learn to read, in part by making the content more personalized, and also by using things like games and contests to try to get kids to read more. And I have a couple of randomized evaluations there where we see that these techniques do in fact get kids to read more and read better. We have a bunch of research trying to help people learn about misinformation and be sort of inoculated against it. And one of the big findings there is that people are really quite impulsive and are more emotionally driven when it comes to social media sharing. And so all the facts in the world, or all of the kind of intellectual education, doesn't affect behavior as much as kind of tapping into people's emotions and explaining to them, eliciting an emotional response in the recipient of the intervention about the fact that people are manipulating their emotions. So getting people emotional about being emotionally manipulated. We have work trying to get people to fill in financial aid forms through text message nudges. And we have work trying to help farmers have ready access to information. So some of the themes through that whole area is that even if information is out there, and people in principle could access it, delivering it to them in a very convenient way, whether it's by highlighting information, or the way it's presented, making it convenient in a text message format, or through timely calls at just the right moment in time that's convenient for people when they're ready to receive the information, has a big impact. Now, a second theme, which is going to be one of the case studies I'm going to talk about, is that AI and digital technology is not just useful directly serving a constituent like a farmer or a learner, but it can also be very impactful helping a service provider help an individual, like helping a teacher be a better teacher, or helping a nurse be a better nurse. And I think that has huge potential, and even more in the world of LLMs. We've worked on charitable giving, which I won't talk about as much today. And then the last big area we've been working on is digital interventions that help workers make job transitions, and through matching markets and others. So in some of the themes that cut across all of this, first of all, why digital? Why is my lab focusing on digital technology? Why does digital have so much potential for development, and especially for serving poor people? And that's, first of all, it's a general purpose technology. So things that companies like Facebook and Meta, or Google, or OpenAI, things that they develop, they may develop it for a profit incentive, but those tools can be applied to, for social impact, even when there's no business case. And so a lot of the core R&D is done either in universities or in big companies. The best practices can be developed there, but then they can be applied. Now, of course, there's a lot of questions that the for-profit people don't answer or they don't focus on as much. While when you're in the impact sector, those questions about distribution, about equity, about being able to serve all different types of people, whether they have good bandwidth or what their education level, like those people might not be as profitable for a for-profit firm, but they're first order for social impact. And so working in the social impact space kind of elevates certain issues, and it presents the opportunity for us as researchers to develop and improve the best practices for that setting. And so it's a great opportunity for applied researchers and for practitioners to actually like push the ball forward and actually push out the research frontier. The second thing is that it's just so scalable. So you can come up with an algorithm, and you're with a couple of graduate students at Stanford, and you can implement it basically for free across millions of people. So that kind of scalability is great for the impact setting, and it's great again for reaching people who have less ability to pay. And just the nature of the R&D process is such that it can be democratized. And then in the area of LLMs, it's kind of like this massive breakthrough, because now actually you can build software products without coding yourself. And so you might think, we don't have enough people who are really good at coding and the whiz bang engineers, but actually now with the latest tools, like even my PhD students in computer science at Stanford don't write a lot of their own lines of code. They think about what the code should do, but they don't actually need to know the syntax. And so that just makes it really easy. And if you build a piece of software, maintaining it is something that the LLMs can do really well. So this is a general purpose technology that can really be democratized. In terms of the behavioral side, one of the themes to push beyond the traditional behavioral work, my work focuses a lot on personalization. A lot of the traditional work focuses on interventions that can do the most good for the most people. But we ask the question, can we do even more good and at the same time learn more about the fundamental mechanisms by developing more targeted behavioral interventions? And so if you find that one intervention works well for one group of people and a different intervention works well for a different group of people, that helps you understand like why those interventions work to start with. It sheds light on what's really going on. And if you start to understand what works for whom, then you can also develop better interventions, and you can see there are some groups that are getting left behind. And if you look at the characteristics of the groups that are being left behind, that helps you motivate you and guide you to better and more tailored interventions. So that's really the beauty of targeting. But although I set off on this research agenda with a lot of optimism, I'll say that in practice, doing this kind of targeting doesn't always work. And it usually works well in an environment where you have lots of data, and you also really have a good solid theory of why something might work well for some group and badly for another group. So with drugs, there's biology, like different people might have the same symptoms, but actually the underlying causes, the genetic causes might be different. And so some drugs will work for some people and not for other people. So there's like a pretty solid theory of that. In the behavioral space, sometimes you may have those theories, you may not. We found that just going back to old experiments and just throwing stuff and saying, gee, I wonder if like one thing works better for some people than others, has not always borne fruit. And that's because, to really find that like one intervention is good for one group and another one is better for another group, like it's hard enough to just have enough data and enough statistical power to show that an intervention improves outcomes. But showing that two like beneficial interventions have different effects, that requires like a lot more data. And it also requires it to be true that that one intervention is better for one group and the other intervention is better for another group. And so it often requires that you're really well measuring the variables that drive those differences. So Although I'm excited about the promise, it kind of it's easy to do if you're at the scale of, YouTube or TikTok, and you have, lots of engineers and lots of data and lots of experience and lots of, behavioral data about people. If you're in the environment of going out and, sending a one-time intervention to people just based on broad demographics, it may or may not help. And like our farmer intervention, we had 1 million farmers and we were targeting on time of day. And we did need to have a fair bit of data about the farmers in order to do a good job targeting. But I do want to like highlight those caveats. Like it sounds intuitive, but it's not something that really works with every project. And in general, though, I would say the accessibility of AI and the fact that it's very easy to generate lots of different versions of interventions, and with LLMs, like they can kind of tailor to you on the fly by answering your questions. There is just a lot of potential in the design part of it. Now, I just put out my presidential address from being the 2023 president of the American Economics Association. The presidential address just came out in the AER. In that paper, we talk a lot about I talk a lot about the innovation cycle that I have seen when tech firms are implementing innovations. And so it's a little bit distinct from the way that I think people might imagine innovation happening. In that I think the popular story is that you have a really good idea, or maybe in the case of behavioral, like there's this great idea from psychology, and then you're going to take that idea and kind of put it into place, and it's going to magically work. But what I have seen for digital interventions in the tech sector is that's not how it works. Like you might have lots of ideas and you go through sort of an innovation cycle where theory and understanding the context and understanding like the social science of the context or the behavioral science of the context guides you in an initial design of an idea. Then you may look at historical data to get a sense of whether your idea is likely to work. You figure out how you can measure and operationalize a success measure for that idea. But then you go through this incremental innovation cycle where you start tailoring the design to the setting. You design a randomized experiment, or some kind of natural experiment, a staggered rollout to different towns or different countries or different regions. You gather the data, you see how it worked, and then you improve the design, and you go round and round and round. And several of my research papers have at least a couple of rounds through this cycle, like my example with the farmers in giving them agricultural advice. We did multiple rounds of experimentation where we improved our targeting after each round. But it can also be like, refining the behavioral interventions on and getting, getting other kinds of feedback to make things better. So the great thing about digital, though, is that like once you figured out how to have a digital relationship with people, it's very easy to change what you're doing. And very low cost, very frictionless. And so that really lends itself to this cycle. In terms of like the targeting part, it's really like two elements I think are important in practice. One is like getting the right content to the right people at the right time and place. So you might target people, and in this case, there's a little decision tree about targeting subsidies for contraceptive use based on age and whether you've had a recent delivery, and giving different subsidies to different people. So that's getting the right, using your budget efficiently according to characteristics. In the case of the farmer advice, we're trying to give people advice at a time that it's most convenient for them and where they're ready to receive the advice. Another theme in my work has been to look at equity efficiency trade-offs. And we may not be thinking about equity just in terms of like a moral justice, but also like, different development institutions may have a mandate or a goal to target certain groups to help bring up their outcomes. And so so we want to think about using personalization to sort of alleviate the trade-offs. So ideally, you can make everybody bring up everybody, but sometimes there are trade-offs between equity and efficiency, or between getting your targeted groups to work well, and overall outcomes. So let me now then make some of these themes more concrete with a case study. This was a case where we designed and implemented a digital assistant for nurses with a hospital in Cameroon. And this was done, we have a paper that came out in Science Advances, and we evaluated this digital assistant for the nurses. So in this case, there were really two problems you're solving. One problem is that a lot of the nurses were not that familiar themselves with the contraceptive methods, with modern contraceptive methods. So it's hard for them to know exactly how to tailor their advice to the patients. The second problem is sort of a problem of the patient's information gathering, that you can get overwhelmed with lots of information. You're not really sure whether it applies to you or not. And so they may not really gain all the information that you would like them to gain. And so part of it is to try to present the information to people in a way that is going to be compelling and trustworthy, but also tailored to them, and induce effort from them to actually find the best method for them. So in this context, we in the tablet application, it created a structured interview where it collects the client's needs and preferences. So instead of the nurses just saying, hey, what's important to you? They go through different criteria that are important for distinguishing between which contraceptive method is the best fit for the patient. The app guides the nurse on how to structure that discussion, and also how much to charge for contraceptives. So it always asks questions of the patients, but once it's finished asking the questions, the app then guides you. There's two different versions of the app about how to discuss the different methods. In the first way to guide the discussion, called the shared decision making, the app prioritizes. And so the patients are told, hey, here are the methods ranked in the order that the app thinks would be most appropriate for you given your information. The second way is that the nurse asks the patient, here's a bunch of methods, which one would you like to talk about first? Okay, and then they discuss the methods and they make a choice. And the big categories of methods are they're all reversible: an IUD, an implant, and the short-acting ones are oral contraception and injections. And the short-acting ones are, in general, have much lower compliance and thus success, because they require this ongoing investment and of time and money on the part of the patients. And so our treatments in the randomized experiment was a factorial design where we randomized the prices for the contraceptives all the way down to free. And we randomized the two different ways of sharing the discussion. And what we think of as the baseline is the full price, no discounts on the contraceptives, and the patient is the one who decides what order to talk about things in. And so what the first set of things we find is that when the app ranks the methods, the patients discuss more methods, and they're more engaged in the conversation. And that's consistent with rational search, with costly effort of talking about things. That like if you sort of trust that the app has ranked them well, then talking about one more method may be worth your time because it's probably pretty good. Then the second thing we do is the panel with the 4 bars in red and blue, that's showing the 4 different treatment arms. So we group together the full price, all the discounted prices and full price, and then we have the 2 different methods of ranking: the patient ranked and the app ranked. So that gives you 4 treatment groups, like patient ranked discounted, patient ranked full, app ranked discounted, app ranked full. And so first, looking at the comparison between full and discounted and the app ranked, we see that when the app is ranking the methods for people, actually the discounts don't seem to have much of an effect. Of course, the confidence intervals of difference are wide, And in some follow-up work, we do find some modest effects of discounts in this group. But in general, it's saying like once you are giving people information in the structured way, the prices don't matter so much. On the other hand, when the patient is the one sort of guiding the order in which you talk about things, the discounts matter quite a bit. So it's saying that like giving people structured information is kind of a substitute for giving them price discounts in terms of LARC adoption. And here the outcome is long-acting reversible contraceptive adoption within 100 days. Then we also see that there's higher adoption of LARCs overall, whether there's discounts or not, when the app ranks versus the patient ranks. And at full price, the app ranking triples the long-acting reversible contraceptive uptake. So I think that this, and then we also look at the impact of personalization, and we find that if we are going to give discounts, the people for whom the discounts are most effective are older women with a recent delivery, so people who just had a baby, or younger women. And so these are kind of, we call like more vulnerable clients. And then everybody else should get half price if we had a fixed budget. And so this is kind of the personalization element. So overall, out of this, I see some big themes. First of all, AI has the potential to augment humans. And any place where we have a scarcity of human teachers, coaches, service providers, doctors, nurses, or any place we have a bottleneck from expensive people's time, AI can and digital technology can help make those people more effective, make them be better service providers. It can help people with less experience or education become effective service providers. Developing software tools using AI is very cheap. It's cheap to make new tools and maintain them. And that should allow countries and companies with less skill to adopt and participate. So it's very easy to build this kind of technology that I just described. It also enables much more personalization. It's just easy to give people the right thing once you're delivering it in this digital way. And then a few comments maybe that can launch into further discussion. There are lots of bigger picture equilibrium effects of bringing in AI. One big one is just open source AI. The fact that I can download AI models, like the ones from Llama, for example, they just released a new one. I can download them. That means they're free now and forever. So if I'm a government or an NGO and I want to build a software product, like I don't have to worry about future funding. If I build the product, like it can just keep running and nobody's going to take it away from me. It actually doesn't even need like updating. It can just keep running. You can bypass procurement. Like when I was in the federal government, I built something and I didn't need to go through procurement because I was using kind of free tools. I did have to worry about security, but not like the cost. And that's going to affect industry structure and also investment. And then a second point, though, is if the AI is in charge, like why pay attention? And a while ago, I wrote a paper about this, a short paper in the AEA Papers and Proceedings that sort of talks about, how if an AI is making all the decisions, like humans may no longer be motivated to gain the skills that the AI has automated, but that can potentially have cost if there's some parts of decision making that the AI isn't good at. You kind of fall asleep at the wheel while the AI is driving the car. And so how we design and implement AI to augment humans, but also like keep humans making the right investments for the most important decisions, and especially the things that AI isn't good at, it will be a really important open question at the intersection of technology and behavioral science, because in the end, we're trying to get people to do the things that are important, and we need to motivate them and nudge them to do that right thing. And we also have to design that human-computer interface in a way that brings out the best in humans and the technology. So let me stop there and we can open for discussion.
Great. Thank you very much for those remarks. There's a lot you've definitely packed in there. There's so much more we can unpick. We're seeing lots of claps coming from the audience there. So thank you for being with us. This is, I can say for sure, a conversation that we have not had in the UN and parts of the conversations that I've been a part of. This is really, really valuable. So there are lots of questions coming in, but maybe I'll start with a general one and then we can get more specific. So As somebody who's worked with large and small organizations, both in public and private sectors, what are some big things you might share in working with public organizations like the UN that we could learn from working in the private sector? Just sort of some bigger overarching lessons about working in the private sector, given your diverse experience. And then we'll go into more detailed questions.
So I think one lesson that is common across big organizations is that a lot of times the reason you don't do something, it's not just that you can't do it once. And like, in the end, you could have an intern at Microsoft or Google, or an intern at the UN, or an intern at the Department of Justice, or an intern at Stanford can build something cool. And that's been true for a long time. It's easy to like say, oh, here's a problem. Like, why don't you just fix that? Like, why is your website so bad? Like, why don't you just make it easier? But then when you're in the leadership and you have to decide, well, if you kind of spread out all of your energy, like doing these one-off fixes, you then create something that needs to be maintained. And then you don't have enough resources to maintain all of those one-off fixes. So you end up like resisting the temptation to kind of just whack-a-mole on little things. And first of all, like want to have an overall strategy of fixing the most important things. But also you need to recognize that fixes require ongoing maintenance. Now, I bring that up because that's really what one of the most revolutionary things of the LLMs is, that they're just very good at modifying software code. And actually not just like one piece of code, but the tools my students use to work on software projects allow you to upload like the whole directory structure of your code in a complicated project, and the AI will read all of the code, and it will understand how everything interrelates to each other better than my students do. Because like I ask them questions, and a lot of times they can't draw the diagram for their own software. And in a bigger project, like you totally can't do that. Like in a bank, they have no idea, they couldn't do that in a million years. But the AI can do that. So I think that that recognizing that we're at a moment where actually, if you democratize fixes and little bits of automation, that you might not be setting up something that's unwieldy to manage, is and that this might be a good moment for developing like smaller one-off things because you can maintain them better. Um, that's a complement, I think, to what I emphasized already, which is just in general, you need to realize when you build stuff that you're building the ability to iterate, not just building the final product. And I think that lesson can go like very high up. Like, do I helicopter in a solution to somebody and walk away? Or, is the way I help a public sector organization like engaging with them sort of on an ongoing basis to really understand their environment and make things better on an ongoing basis. And that second way I've found more effective.
For sure, what you describes it's really a massive change in the way the UN would work and operate, given where we are now. There's a ton of low-hanging fruit in these spaces. So I think this really opens up a lot of conversation there. So I'd be curious to hear from colleagues of where you might be exploring these kind of tools and areas of work, and maybe we can unpack some of those as well, because this is, yes, a lot of the UN is process. A lot of the UN is, quite frankly, bureaucracy. If we can kind of overcome a lot of that with these the new advances in technology, there's a ton we could explore. So thank you for that. Okay, I'm going to go through some of the more top-ranked questions here regarding I think some colleagues have read your literature, so we're going to maybe go in a little bit at a high level some of that. So you've written extensively about the intersection of causal inference and machine learning. So when we talk about behavioral science, we often refer to the causal inference and the work that we do, not always used in the UN. So your intersection there with machine learning. How can behavioral scientists better incorporate causal thinking into their research when traditional randomized control trials are impractical or maybe unethical in different contexts? What might you say to that question?
Yeah, so I mean, there are many settings and many business settings too, where it's difficult to run randomized experiments. People don't want to be like experimenting on price is something that's, very off-putting to people. So it's not just ethics that makes sort of randomized experiments hard. Or you might be you might be interested in changing something that'll change your market equilibrium, but it might change it like at a national level. So you can't really do that. So there are a lot of applied techniques around natural experiments that can help you in those contexts. I think you I would say that when you can't do a randomized experiment, the importance of theory and a conceptual framework are really important. So then that's when like you really need to write out like, what is your theory of change? What is the context? What are the feedback effects? And then you can look at pieces of the problem one at the time. And maybe you can't experiment on the whole thing, but you can test components or measure components. And once you start thinking about things that way, then, okay, maybe I can use recruited subjects in a survey experiment with hypothetical outcomes. Not perfect, but it's a way to prototype. In my work on misinformation, for example, and that's really the wrong term. It's really my work on like digital education and digital literacy, because we're really just teaching people. We're not debunking specific context or teaching them specific information. We're more teaching people how to recognize when they're being manipulated, or recognize different tactics that are used in online work. We did a lot of prototyping with recruited subjects, and experiments with those subjects to try in a context where people are consenting, and the external validity is not as high, but on the other hand, we can iterate so much faster, and we can get like much more accurate and precise measures of our outcomes. So there's a little bit of a trade-off between getting an outcome which may or not be valid and doesn't capture everything, it's artificial, but on the other hand, it's very well powered, and that's how I can learn. So that's a very common trade-off in the tech sector, that you kind of optimize for clicks. You don't care about clicks, but you've got a very high signal on that, and so you can learn a lot. But then you also have to complement that with kind of other techniques to think about how something impacts your market, and just to think about how this can go wrong. Like, say if a video sharing platform just optimizes for clicks, it can very quickly like kind of radicalize people by sending them to stuff that's sort of more and more extreme, or that it looks appealing, but then you are disappointed when you look at the content. So it's a little bit like putting, my colleague Cinna Melanathan talks about it, it's like putting Doritos on a table in front of someone, and like, yes, you eat it, and if you're just measuring whether people eat what's on your table, like Doritos will be at the top, but then people might not want to come back to your house, because like the last time they came, they went home and felt terrible. So these trying to find good short-term measures, but being very aware of what they're leaving out, is super important.
Very good point. We've heard Sendel recently share that example, and it really resonated across the UN. So thank you for bringing it up again. And
I was so bummed about that, actually, because I've been telling that story for like 15 years, but like my examples were very like technical, and now like
Doritos.
he just killed me with the Doritos, which goes back to like behavioral science, actually, like telling the story well it's not enough to just be right. I was right. And I had important examples about like
Mhm.
radicalizing people, but the Doritos kind of sticks in your
Did
head.
it?
So,
Yeah.
I go with Doritos now. I give credit where credit's due.
That's it. No, completely. We'll find some global relevant example as well. But it's interesting because often when we think about our behavioral science, as we talk about our quote unquote methods in the UN, we do a lot of the diagnostic, trying to figure out what principle we're going to test and why. But I think this really underscores not only that, but like we don't just automatically assume we're doing a randomized control trial. There's so much you can unpack there. And if you understand the context, then you can start to understand not only which principles you want to test, but also how to evaluate, what are your outcome measures and all of that as well. So there's so much there to think about too.
Yeah, let me actually say one other thing about how I really learned this lesson, because
Yeah.
I had been doing mostly actually like kind of some structural work in economics, but also was very familiar with applied causal inference methods and randomized experiments. And then when I was chief economist at Microsoft, they would ask me questions like, you know, well, how much should we pay if we buy Yahoo search engine? Um, and I was like, well, I can't answer that question. Like I have a great idea for like a piece of the problem,
Mhm.
but there's a bunch of things I don't know. And then what they said was, well, Susan, we're gonna in like 2 weeks, the CEOs are going to meet and we're going to recommend a number. So do you want to contribute to that, or do you want us to just use, and they showed me what they were doing, and I was like, okay, I can do better than that. And
Mhm.
I actually think the better analogy to what we would do in those like kind of decisions is it's a little bit like calibrated macroeconomics, or really what the way I might reinterpret some parts of structural industrial organization and economics. In both cases, like you're writing down a model and you are using facts and data to kind of, say the parameters of the model. But it turns out, you can get somewhere by saying, well, like this number would have to be really large in order for this decision to be good or bad. And so what they do in the business world is they kind of look at scenarios like high, medium, low, and then they say, well, in order to believe the high scenario, you'd have to believe that, scale economies are big and blah and blah and blah. And for the low scenario, the things that are driving that are A, B, and C. And so that required me to grow as a researcher, to like embrace a way of doing things that was different than what I had done in my research. But I was kind of won over because what I had learned in my academic training was like, okay, here's the model, and then let's work really hard to get the standard errors right on this one coefficient, and like you have to prove theorems and take exams in graduate school about, what properties of beta hat in some regression. But in decision making, like those errors around the sampling variation, they are like very important. And you absolutely need to know if like all of your results are due to sampling variation. That's important. But when it comes to the magnitudes, probably like modeling assumptions and things you've left out are like much more important than, heteroscedasticity corrected standard errors or something. So putting things in context and realizing that like the theoretical framework is as important or more important than, the statistics of your specific number. Now, of course, you want your statistics right. Like, absolutely, you want your
Yeah.
statistics right. You can
Mhm.
be misled, very misled, but it's like it's not enough. You can't have that to the exclusion of everything else. And in an environment where you can't run an experiment, then you really have to be creative about like sort of calibrating your model.
Exact, completely. This is very parallel. What you're talking about, the business context, this parallels incredibly well with the policy and programming context. We communicate our results in different situations and spaces. So I worked as an economist for a while and within governments, and just communicating the uncertainty around whatever it was, whether it's one or two, three scenarios, just I would just push people on asking about my assumptions, because people wouldn't ask me about my assumptions. They would just sort of say, what's your summary statistic, or what's your incremental cost effectiveness ratio, and that's it. And then over time I would work with people to kind of build that up, and that's something that we're building in the UN too, is not to just take these, it's an RCT, it must be, that is the result, it's all this effort and time that's been put into this, let's just not assume that is the case that'll work. And obviously to your points about things you're talking about, and other parts of personalization too, it's not just these are the statistics that some economists has come to the table with, let's believe them. There's so much more to unpack, and I think this AI data conversation really helps us see that in different ways that maybe for quite frankly years, that maybe wasn't so much there. But
Can I
maybe,
pick up on
yeah,
can I pick up on 2 points
sure.
from what you said? One is a story and one is an observation about new AI. If you think about what people don't like about ChatGPT right now, it's that and its variations, not just one company, but it's that you ask it a question and it like gives you an answer in a really convincing way, but it's like just as convincing if it's totally making things up and as if it's, right or wrong. I was at a thing with the IMF where like if you asked about inflation in Brazil in 1982, it would quote the table correctly, it would use all the terminology correctly, but the number would be wrong.
Mhm.
And it's just like because the way that those models are trained for like next word prediction, it's not, there's nothing in it that's sort of really teaching it to communicate the way a human would do, which is like, well, I'm not quite, like I know it's in that table, but I think it's 2.5, but I don't quite remember whether it's 2.5 or 4.5. Let's look it up. Like that's
Mhm.
not the way that these models have been working so far. And so actually part of the human computer interaction is going to be, how do you express uncertainty? Or if it's a political question, like instead of saying, well, the answer is, vaccines are good or vaccines are bad, how do you express to say like, well, most scientists say this, there are groups that say that, like here's the references, like here's the criticisms group A has of group B, here's the criticism group B has of group A. How do you when do you do that? How do you do that? Do people even want that? What is the question they're asking when they enter something into a chat? And how do you understand what they're asking, and how do you communicate the answer back? That's something across the board. As humans, we haven't quite figured out how to do, and now we're asking our machines to do it at scale. So communicating uncertainty is very important. And then my little anecdote is I had this chart a company I worked with that was used a lot. And here was the chart with the statistical evidence, but there was a whole bunch of caveats. And then I kept seeing my chart turn up on other people's PowerPoints without the caveats. And I'm like, wait, you can't use it that way. So my little trick was I actually, I started, when I had caveats on an empirical thing, I would actually not put it in as an editable PowerPoint object, but I would
Mm.
actually make an image that had the words on the image, so you couldn't take them off without having to make a funny shape and cover it. I guess AI might make it easier to remove it now, but I made it, I wanted to make it really hard for people to show my graph without the caveats.
Nice, I like that. I mean, it's so interesting. It's so parallel. I was, yeah, when I was doing some analysis, I remember I had a statistic and it was just broken telephone across government, and it came back to me and I was like, oh, that's my number. That's what I calculated a year ago. Anyway, there's lots here to unpack, but let's go back to the audience questions. We're just chatting about our experiences here. So there are a few questions about, you brought up personalization in many different ways and why that's important. So maybe I'll pull on a couple questions here. So there's one about, if there might be potentially a trade-off concerning privacy rights and autonomy, and how would you deal with that? And maybe just building on that question, being able to identify heterogeneous treatment effects requires access to diverse ranges of data types. So in the development context, this often means increasing data collection costs. You're not Microsoft necessarily with our data yet. Hopefully in the future we can say something different. What are some things people could consider to overcome these limitations, where we don't have access to data at our fingertips? What could we do? So over to you in those 2
Yeah,
points.
so those are great questions, and the privacy issue is super important. I guess I'm going to give one solution that only works in some context, but it's just so only a partial answer. In some cases, especially as we have people more comfortable and familiar with these sort of chat interventions, is that you can just ask people, before you deliver the service, and that's really what the nurse application did. It was a structured way for people to give their information. Now, in principle, the app doesn't have to store that. Of course, for incremental improvement, you would like to store that because you can use it to make the algorithms better. But to serve an individual, you don't have to store it. You just have to have coded the thing up to give state contingent answers. So, if you say you're concerned about, you know, if you're concerned about a certain side effect, then don't recommend this particular treatment. That kind of thing can be coded up, and the personalization kind of happens on the fly. And so that's what we've used in these kind of more data sparse environments, where we've recruited people to experiments like my social media experiments. You were recruiting them on social media. You can get some demographics by scraping the social media, but you can also just ask people, and of course, each of them has their problems. They each have measurement error, but you get around the privacy issues by just asking people. Now, that doesn't work if you're sort of doing kind of a push intervention and the people aren't individually, interacting with it, obviously. But that's also where theory comes in, that you want to, often there's sort of a theory of why something would work well for some people than others. And so you can focus your data collection on the things that matter. But I will say, a lot of, my academic success has been on these heterogeneous treatment effect methods. A friend said, one of my former students who was a theory student was like, Susan, I looked at your Google Scholar, and Google Scholar thinks you're an econometrician. And I'm like, well, yeah, I kind of am. But also, that's kind of just, building tools can sometimes reach a lot of people. But I have a lot invested in those tools, but also they don't always work. And I don't always use them myself. In environments where you just don't have a lot of data or you don't have the right demographics. And I've even tried, like we did this thing with PayPal where we had 1 million people and we were giving different messages for charitable giving. And like we did not see a lot of gains from personalization. I think in part because even though like we did have actually access to their purchase history and stuff, but the things that we observed were not the things that would make different behavioral techniques work well. So sometimes behavioral, if things are orthogonal to like easily observable demographics, then behavioral interventions like might not be the best candidate for targeting. So I would like put a cautionary note on these fancy dancy techniques. They sound super exciting, but they don't you need to be able to explain to another human why you think they're going to work and really be able to tell the story. And if you can't tell the story, you're maybe unlikely to find the effects.
Yeah, that's a good point as well. You talked about some of the principles and how these magical behavioral science principles aren't going to solve everything, but also the ways we can evaluate, understand causally and otherwise, that's also not going to be a solution to everything.
But
So
treatment effects are very noisy. So heterogeneous treatment effects are super noisy. One
yeah,
of the things that we do in our paper on federal financial aid forms, that was another one where we actually saw like modest benefits to personalization. We had a randomized experiment with about 40,000 people, so big experiment. But most of the demographics we observed about people were not important for predicting whether text message nudges help them or not. It turned out what was really predictive was like their baseline probability of re-enrolling in college. So it turns out like a really big reason people don't respond to nudges to fill out financial aid forms is because that's not very beneficial if you're not sure if you're going back to college, or if you're sure you're not going back to college. It's really not beneficial. So just looking at predicted baselines in a like noisy environment, just looking at predicted baselines can be a good way to target. But one of the other things that was kind of interesting there is that we weren't sure whether you should nudge the people who are very likely to fill out the form or the people who are very unlikely to fill out the form. And it turned out in this case, people who were very likely to fill out the form were the ones who were better to nudge. And actually the sweet spot was middle likelihood to fill out the forms, but middle to high was much better than targeting people who weren't going to fill out the forms. And what we discovered from the data was it looks like the people who weren't going to fill out the form were also not going to enroll in college. They were predictably, we could use the data to predict that they were also unlikely to enroll. And so now we have a theory, but the theory what did emerge from the data. So predicted outcomes can be a good way to target like the risky people, but it's not always clear for behavioral nudges whether you want to target the risky people or the non-risky people. And again, you can think it through, like what are reasons why are people risky? And that might tell you something about whether the intervention will work.
exactly. This is interesting parallel some of the work in the UN done with vaccination. It was called the movable middle. When people are trying to incentivize people to get vaccinated, there's, the people in the middle are almost there, not quite. Maybe it's making it easy for them to get vaccinated versus the ones who are just, it's just not, like, they're not as movable. So interesting
Exactly. Or they
parallels.
have
Yeah,
some contraindication. So in some
exactly.
sense, like if you were doing personalization, if the things that predict whether you're in the movable middle, even if you can't, even if you don't have a full RCT of your nudge, you could theorize about targeting those people.
Exactly. Exactly. Okay, so we only have a few more minutes left. I feel like we could go on longer. We've had comments in the chat about lots of the communicate longer, but maybe I'll back up a bit, maybe ask some general questions here. So there's a question about what was your initial inspiration for studying heterogeneity and personalization? Maybe a bit of a personal one, maybe just to also build on that if I can before you answer. Um, there's a bit around, well, a compliment versus start. You've been ahead of the curve in your research beyond machine learning and AI. What do you think is the next frontier for behavioral science? I know it's a very big question, but what do you think are spaces we could be particularly applying behavioral science to? It's a bit of a personal question, and then looking towards the future, where
Yes,
can we
so
take this?
it's maybe the answer for the personalization is a little tactical, but
Mm,
I was watching the A/B testing platforms at big tech and seeing that they were actually like over worried about like standard errors and data mining. So they had very strict rules about what gets shipped as a result of a randomized experiment, because they're running
Mhm.
thousands of them, and so they don't look at them one by one. So they had like pretty strict rules. So some engineers might spend 3 months building something, and then it would fail the A/B test, and they just throw it away, or they'd go back to the drawing board. And my observation was that they were being a little too strict, and they should do ex post analysis of the data. But then I understood that they wanted it to be sort of automated and reliable. And so the motivation for the heterogeneous treatment effects was something that would give you insights, but it wouldn't be like cherry picked data mined insights. There would be a reproducible way of giving you those insights afterwards. And so the first applications was just building this into A/B testing platforms and tech firms so that they could both understand why things didn't work and perhaps release something just for the users where it did work. And that you might think that's so obvious, like how could they not be good at that? But a lot of the engineers building things are not really data scientists, and it was kind of cumbersome and time consuming to do post hoc analysis, and a lot of times it didn't have a lot of credibility. And again, you might be making 100 decisions in one meeting, so you just people wouldn't really pay attention to it. And so having it be systematic and automated was important. But that's also a lot of the same considerations we have in science. We want it to be replicable, and we want to be able to explain how we got these numbers. We weren't just fishing around until we finally got a good t statistic. So the although there were different contexts, they both needed the same themes. And so I realized that was a gap, because the machine learning people at the time were not thinking about causal inference at all. They were running experiments, but they weren't thinking about like the analytical side of causal inference. And so there was a gap that I kind of walked into and filled. Um, in terms of the next frontiers for behavioral science, I'll give another observation. I was on the board of a company that did peer-to-peer car sharing, and they did a lot of behavioral science to try to get the guests, the people who rent the cars, to not trash the cars, because hosts wouldn't want to keep hosting the car if their guests trash the car. And so just reminding them that the host was a human who owned the car would lead people to behave better. And I think, you have that in like Airbnbs and in Ubers and Lyfts and so on as well. Like you want to gently nudge the consumer. The consumer is part of this too. And if badly behaved consumers make the whole marketplace worse. So, but when you said like, oh, should we hire behavioral scientists? Well, if you looked out in the literature, there actually wasn't much behavioral science that went beyond what the engineers had already figured out. Like what really mattered here was actually having a good experimentation pipeline, a good incremental innovation pipeline to test things. And you were generating, like, if you wanted to have relevant insights for this context, it was much more useful to have done 10 experiments in this context than it was to read some psychology literature about, what makes people think about others. And so, or you could just read it, but like you didn't need an expert in it. You could just look at the literature and get some ideas. But by the time somebody had worked on this for 2 years, they knew more probably than any professor about this topic. So I would say that, like, I think that this iterative innovation cycle, the criticism is always going to be it's too tactical. Like real behavioral scientists find something fundamental, and like people doing experimentation at Turo are not scientists, and it's too tactical. But I would argue there's another way to look at it, which is that if you really explore that space well and you see what works and what doesn't, you can generate new behavioral insights and then theorize around them. So I think like the practice is going to get ahead of the theory. And what's important about the theory is that you're constantly trying to put your findings in a theoretical framework. So it's important to be a good conceptual thinker and to have the practice of using theory, like conceptual theory. But it's not that some learning from the past or something that somebody wrote down in 1963 like is going to be the most useful behavioral theory. In the end, we'll probably need new conceptual frameworks, and especially around the computer human interaction.
Really, this resonates so well with the UN. I mean, this parallels in that the UN often functions in spaces where there just isn't literature, like there in maritime spaces or peace and security contexts, or So, we often have colleagues who are like, what does behavioral science mean to me? What value can this provide? It's on the Secretary General's agenda. Where can we take it? And then we start to have these sorts of conversations. This is very much parallels. It's less about what's the psychology principle that we're tackling. It's more about how do we understand what works? How do we understand human behavior in the specific context or place or time? And just to give one quick example here, so one of our fellows based in Argentina, she was looking at domestic worker registration to Social Security. This is with the International Labor Organization, our colleague Claire Hobden. And she was looking at literature, and there wasn't a lot of literature, behavioral science literature on this specific topic, particularly in the global South, in South Latin America and the Caribbean. So she was one of the first projects, and how she started that was less about the literature and was about how do you run a good experiment. She did an online experiment. She also did some field work as well. And it was like that was the core of what she did and the value she added. And she changed policy, and now she's scaling it up to other countries within the Latin American Caribbean region. So yes, it's not always about the behavioral science principles and ideas, but it's really about how do we understand what works and test and go forward with that. So this
Yeah,
is
and clear
great.
thinking, clear structured thinking. And so I
Mhm.
think you learn that if you get a master's degree or a PhD, because you see
Mhm.
other people's clear structured thinking and you understand what that looks like. But a lot of times you're coming up with your own novel, clear structured thinking for your problem.
Exactly. There's so much to unpack here. But thank you so much for joining us. We've gone already over time. We
Okay.
haven't answered all the questions, but hopefully we'll continue this discussion as we go. Thank you so much for joining us. This has opened up a lot for us to think about going forward, and hopefully we continue our discussion.
Thanks for having me here. Take care.
Thank
Have a
you.
good day.
Bye.
Bye-bye.